Pennsylvania, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Wenstrup, for convening this important hearing, and thank you, Dr. Fauci, for testifying. Dr. Fauci, one of the controversial regulations of the pandemic was the 6-foot distancing rule. This rule became an important policy consideration in subsequent regulations. However, you testified recently, and I'm quoting, "This 6-foot rule sort of just appeared." Do you think that a rule that sort of just appeared is substantial justification for the regulations that we saw based on that 6-foot rule?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I answered that, but I'll summarize it briefly for you. When saying it just appeared, it came from the CDC.
Okay, you stated that earlier. What was your relationship with the CDC when you saw a regulation which was not based in the current science?
Well, when I say was not based in science, I meant a prospective clinical trial to determine whether 6 foot was better than 3, was better than 10.
But once we realized that the virus was not spread by droplets and was aerosolized, did you feel an indication to go back to the CDC and said, let's base this on science. Let's get rid of this 6-foot rule. This 6-foot rule crippled businesses. It allowed students to stay at home and not learn. Americans suffered. And that suffering continues because the fracture of trust in American scientists continues to this day. Did you not feel an obligation for something that just sort of appeared, not to go back to the CDC and say, let's base this on what we know?
It was a CDC decision, and it was clear.
Were you dialoguing with the CDC?
Excuse me?
Were you in communication with the CDC?
CDC was part of the coronavirus response team. Yeah.
And you didn't feel an obligation to go to them and say, look, Americans aren't going to trust us.
Yeah.
We're providing them with misinformation.
We have discussions at the White House about that. We did, but the CDC's decision and was their decision to make, and they made it.
And you didn't feel an obligation as the lead scientist at the NIH to challenge that?
I've challenged the CDC multiple times.
Publicly on this regard?
Excuse me?
Publicly, you challenged them on the 6-foot distancing rule?
It is not appropriate to be publicly challenging a sister organization.
Do you agree that Americans now have lost their trust in science, in lead science from government because of misinformation like this?
Well, when you talk about misinformation, I think that you have to be careful. It's not disinformation. It was information that ultimately proved, when you put the aerosolization in, that
it was not an effective rule to have 6 feet of distancing. Dr. Fauci, let's move on. On April 21st, Dr. Morens wrote to Dr. Daszak in an email that there is no worry about FOIAs. I can either send stuff to Tony on his private Gmail, hand it to him at work, or at his house. He is too smart to let colleagues send him stuff that could cause trouble. Do you realize that this impact still considers today? This is your lead trusted researcher who works with you, your advisor. Do you realize the impact of that?
It was a terrible thing. It was wrong, and it was inappropriate.
Thank you.
I
think we all agree it was incredibly inappropriate. Recently, in an op-ed that Senator Roger Marshall published just yesterday, he raised concern about HHS FOIA compliance following your testimony in front of the Senate Help Committee. Dr. Fauci, what involvement did you have in HHS not responding to FOIA requests following your testimony in the Senate in 2021?
I had no role whatsoever in anything to do with the request. When FOIA is made, it doesn't go directly to a person like me. It goes to a department, which then takes care of it. So I don't have any role one way or the other in FOIA.
Let's go on. Were you aware that NIAID employees conducting official work on unofficial emails and inappropriately assisting grantees during your time as a director?
I was not aware of that as it was occurring. It obviously came out during the committee hearings, but I was not aware of that.
And I think that you put an exclamation point on how important these hearings are. Dr. Fauci, would you agree that this demonstrates the need for more accountability and increased oversight of NIAID?
What you saw, I believe, with Dr. Morens was an aberrancy and an outlier. The individuals at the NIH and NIAID are a very committed group of individuals, and this one instance that you point out is an aberrancy and an outlier. That does
From
not
your senior advisor for 20 years.
Well, the title is senior advisor. We wrote scientific papers together. He didn't advise me, as I mentioned.
Are your senior advisors not trusted staff?
Again, I told you that his title was senior advisor, but he is not an advisor on policy.
That's very confusing to have someone's title and not having that to be their obligation.
But that is the fact, though.
I think that supports what we said. There needs to be more oversight and there needs to be more accountability. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but these points are very clear to all of us today in this hearing room. I yield back.
I now recognize